In this video, I want to consider 5 signs that atheist you are talking to is not serious. And now let me give a couple caveats at the beginning. The first thing is that these are indicators, they're signs, so the presence of one of them doesn't automatically mean this person is not serious, although they certainly are warning signs. Second thing is that you may decide that you want to have a conversation with this person, even if they exhibit one or more of these signs. That's fine. What these signs are about is simply to indicate where this person is at. They may very well at this time be contemptuous of Christianity. They may not be in a position to take Christianity as an intellectually serious position or to have a charitable, meaningful, rational exchange about it. That is simply what these signs are indicative of. And so that just allows you to enter into any conversation or develop any relationship with the knowledge that this is probably where this person is at currently in their journey. And so then you can make an informed decision about how you want to proceed. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the 5 signs that atheist you are talking to is not serious. Number 5, he calls Jesus a zombie. Okay, zombies are the undead. The whole idea of a zombie is that it is a reanimated corpse. It is neither living nor dead. By contrast, Jesus is a resurrected human being. In fact, not only is Jesus brought back to life again at the resurrection, but he has a fuller form of life and existence than any other human being has in history, because he has a resurrection body, an eternal body that is incorruptible, that cannot die. Now, you can accept the resurrection of Jesus or you can reject it, but you have to appreciate that that's what the claim is. So when you call Jesus a zombie, you're either exhibiting an egregious ignorance, both as to what zombies are and as to what Jesus is in terms of the Christian doctrine of resurrection, and or you are also exhibiting contempt for Christians, an attempt to just be dismissive of them and perhaps to act in an irreverent, disrespectful way toward them. And that is not a sign of a person who is serious. So that's number 5. The person calls Jesus a zombie. Now for number 4, while he mocks Young Creationism, he thinks Jesus' mythicism is perfectly reasonable. Now, the point to appreciate here is that Jesus' mythicism and Young Creationism are very much alike in one key respect, and that is that each of these positions is rejected by the vast majority of academics. When it comes to Young Earth Creationism, the vast majority of biblical scholars reject Young Earth Creationism. And in terms of science, as you can imagine, the vast majority of geologists and of astronomers or cosmologists and biologists all reject Young Earth Creationism. So it is a position that will be held by like less than 1% of academics in the relevant fields in terms of science, Earth history, the Bible, and so on. The same thing is true of Jesus' mythicism when it comes to ancient historians, when it comes to biblical scholars, when it comes to classics. The vast majority, more than 99% of scholars in those fields would reject Jesus' mythicism. It's frankly kind of a crazy position. And I'm using crazy here obviously in a loose sense, an incredibly implausible position. And another thing is, just as the only Young Earth Creationists you will meet are in all likelihood Christians, right? So the only Jesus mythicists you ever meet are atheists, outspoken atheists, right? And so this is indicative of some motivated reasoning. In terms of scholars who are Jesus mythicists, you maybe think Richard Carrier, you might think of Robert Price, you might think Raphael Lattister, who Lattister and Carrier both make a big deal of having published peer-reviewed books in this field, but of course they're books that have been ignored because they adopt theories that are really bordering on conspiracy theory level, and so it's just not taken intellectually seriously. Now you can take that position, right? You can take a position that really only thrives among the internet infidels, among atheist bloggers or YouTubers. You can defend that position, but then don't treat Young Earth Creationism as a crazy position, because you've really, in terms of your epistemology relative to expert consensus opinion, you've adopted the same kind of extreme position as a Young Earth Creationist the climate denier, or frankly, even um, like the person who denies moon landing, or the person who believes in lizard people. It's that bad. So that's number 4. Number 3, he defines faith as irrational belief. So what is faith? William Ladd Sessions, about 25 years ago, published a significant monograph on faith where he outlined 6 major ways the concept of faith is used in different religious traditions. What he points out, I think, is that there's a family resemblance term, but it does have a lot of difference in its various expressions. But in its most common usage, both in terms of lay people, like average everyday people, as well as in a religious context, faith at its core is trust. So for example, let's say that there's a mountain climber and he's a novice, but he's working with an expert mountain climber who he's hired as a guide. And they're in this crisis moment, and the guide is asking him to jump into what it looks like the void down below, because he's like trapped and he can't escape. The only way to do is the only thing he can do is cut the line and fall into the void, but he thinks that will be certain death. And so he just keeps hanging there. But then he hears the voice of the expert he's with call out to him and say, "Cut the line. Do you have faith in me? Cut the line." Well, what he's saying there is, do you trust me, right? And so this guy cuts the line, falls safely into snow, and now he can continue on down the mountain because he had faith in the expert. That's how we typically use the term faith. And that's the primary way that the term faith is used within the Christian tradition too. In the Greek word pistis is to have trust in. So when Jesus asks us to have faith in him, he's asking us to trust him. And the important thing to note is that the trust he asks of us is not an irrational trust. It is rather a rational trust based upon science and evidence. And you just have to take a look at the Gospels to see this. So for example, when Jesus, just to give one example, in Mark chapter 2, when he heals a man who was handicapped, disabled, and then people are outraged, what right do you have to heal? When he forgives the man's sins, and people say, well, right, do you have to forgive his sins? Then Jesus says, so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, and then he heals him. The idea there is that in order to provide evidence to support the claim that he can forgive sins, he now performs a healing, which is a sign. That's evidence. And what that is evidence of is that you can trust me, you can have faith in me, that I do have the authority to do this because I provided evidence. Now that is commonly how faith is used within the Christian tradition. There are other expressions of it, but that's the primary way. So when people try to claim that faith is fundamentally, by definition, irrational, they're simply engaging in straw man, and that's not serious. Number 2, he insists that Young Creationism is the most intellectually honest version of Christianity. Now, I think there are 2 reasons why people do this. One reason is because they themselves were once fundamentalist Christians who held to Young Earth Creationism. And so they think, well, because that's what they've known, that's the only intellectually respectable form of Christianity, the only honest one. And typically they do that as well because they accept from Young Earth Creationism a hermeneutical principle or an interpretive principle that says, interpret literally where possible. And so if Bible says in Genesis 1 that God created in 6 days, you ought to interpret that as a literal 6 days. And in Revelation chapter 20, if Satan is locked into a pit for 1,000 years, then it's a literal pit and it's a literal 1,000 years and it's a literal lock, because that's the most honest way to read the text. But of course, the literal where possible principle is in fact an absurd principle. And it's one that you should absolutely reject and instead interpret each text relative to the literary genre and the socio-historical context to the degree that you can reconstruct that. That's how you interpret texts, not by some one-size-fits-all literal where possible principle. So that first reason that people adopt this number 2 sign is just a sign of their own fundamentalist baggage. I think the second thing as well that often motivates this one is a desire, frankly, at some level to straw man. They recognize that Young Earth Creationism is the most intellectually vulnerable form of Christianity, or certainly among the most intellectually vulnerable, and so they want to present Young Earth Creationism as the strongest, most honest form of Christianity so that they can knock it down and thereby straw man Christianity. This is a number 2, is a great sign that that person is not being serious. And that brings me to my number one sign that people are not being serious as an atheist, and that is that the person says that rocks and dogs are atheists. Okay, so historically, the word atheist has meant alpha privative. The A is the alpha privative. Atheist means without or against belief in God. And what that has meant historically is that the person who is an atheist believes that a particular concept of God is false, that it is not exemplified, it is not true. And so in the West, because Western monotheism has been particularly dominant, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, then typically the first thing people mean when they say they're an atheist is that they are denying belief in that kind of being. That kind of being does not exist on their view. Now, T.H. Huxley, in this 19th century, came up with another definition for the term agnostic. So again, alpha privative, and then the Greek gnosis to agnosis, to be without knowledge. And so agnostic came to mean, first of all, a strong agnostic is a person who says nobody can know or have rational, even have reasonable belief as to whether God exists or not. And then a weak agnostic is simply a person who is themselves without belief in the existence of God or the non-existence of God. In recent years, people have begun using online, not in the academy, but online, internet atheists and so on, have begun to use the term atheist or the word atheist and given to it a definition roughly equivalent to weak agnostic. In other words, I'm an atheist, meaning I'm just without belief in God. But of course, again, that is historically what has been weak agnosticism. So what we have here is people are, in a sense, are free to define terms however they want, as long as they're clear on their definitions. But this is not helpful when you begin to collapse distinctions, and this is leading to obfuscation, given that atheist has historically meant belief in the non-existence of God. And then some even go further and to say, well, if I'm an atheist, meaning I'm just without belief in God, then if rocks are without belief in God and dogs are without belief in God, then rocks and dogs are all atheist. And there seems to be some sort of really strange attempt to give atheism a leg up over theism by saying it's the default position, because anything that does not affirm the proposition God exists is thereby an atheist, which is just kind of silly. The one thing that really bothers me about this terminological shift, apart from the confusion that it generates, is that in my experience, the vast majority of people who say they are atheist, meaning they are without belief in God, actually believe God does not exist. They actually believe Christianity is false and that theism is false, but they don't have the courage of their convictions to be able to defend that as a rational, reasoned argument with another person. And so when pressed on what their definition of atheism is, they retreat to this new milquetoast definition of atheism as roughly weak agnosticism by saying I'm simply without belief in God. And that, my friends, is not serious. So those are my top 5 signs to show that a particular atheist you're talking to is not serious. Again, you may choose to have that conversation despite that fact. That's perfectly fine. But this just helps you know what you are getting into.